Hello and welcome everyone from our T4 Communities app who are joining us today for this very special spotlight on embedding current affairs in the curriculum. My name's Salman Shaheen. I'm Director of Communications at T4 Education. Prior to joining the dark side, as it's called in our industry, I was a journalist myself for a decade. And I've always been very passionate about current affairs. I've always been interested to see how current affairs can be taught to the next generation to really tell them about the world around them. Now, before I introduce our fantastic speaker, just a little bit of housekeeping. First, can I ask everyone to mute themselves when you're not talking, or if not, Caro will be able to mute you for you, just so we don't get any background noise. What we're going to do is we're going to record this session. So please be aware that this session is recorded and will be available on demand on our T4 Communities app for forevermore. So please do bear that in mind if you wish to speak later in this in this session. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker. Robert Poole. Robert is Head of PSHE in a large UK secondary school and a qualified English and geography teacher. In addition to that, he's also the editor of the journal Education for Tomorrow and was awarded the Ron Todd Award for Social Justice and named a Big Issue Top 100 Changemaker. I also want to thank The Day magazine for arranging this meeting with Robert, this session with Robert. The Day has been a fantastic partner with T4 Education for the last couple of years. It's always a pleasure to work with The Day. And as a result of that partnership, I'm very pleased to tell you that The Day is offering all T4 Education listeners a 10% discount on the price of membership to The Day, plus an additional 2 months free if you sign up before March 28th. And if you want to know more about it, my colleagues are writing in the chat box with the website where you can sign up. Now, The Day is really instrumental in helping teachers to teach current affairs in their curriculums to their students. And I want to hand over to Robert in just a second about how he does that, and he can impart his wisdom on that. The structure of this is Robert's going to talk, as in all our spotlights. Robert is going to talk for 35, 40 minutes, however long you need, Robert. After that, we'll leave time for a bit of Q&A. When it comes to Q&A, you can either drop comments in the chat and I will happily read them out, or you can put your hand up and I'll happily call you to speak yourself. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Robert. Take it away.
Thanks for that introduction, Salman, and thanks for everyone coming today and for the invite. It's great to see people from all over the world and join this sort of global community and the fantastic work that T4 are doing. So Salman's introduced myself, so I'll go straight into it. The Guardian newspaper in England reported a few years ago that 60% of Britons believed in conspiracy theories. And that sounds like a pretty shocking statistic. And it might even be a deadly one with things that have happened, over the past sort of 4 or 5 years. It feels like we're living in an age of conspiracy theories. But then I also think perhaps we always have lived in an age of conspiracy theories. Maybe it's not a new thing at all. People in general yearn to understand the world, and they always have. They want to know about the events going on around them. And because of this, humans invent reasons to try and explain the unexplainable. Is there a volcanic eruption? There must be an angry god in the mountain. There's a virus spreading around the world. There's economic inequality. Oh, it must be something to do with mobile phone masts or microchips in vaccines or a conspiracy of people in pizza restaurants in Washington. And the world can feel like an increasingly difficult place to live in. And we're facing multiple simultaneous crises: war, climate change, artificial intelligence. And trying to navigate these topics is fraught. Despite, or maybe perhaps because of, the fact we have more news sources than ever. And of course, it's led to an avalanche of misinformation and disinformation. And as educators, it's our job to try and help young people in our care to navigate this increasingly complex and confusing world. Now, here in the UK, I don't know if it's the same in other parts of the world, the media is pushing this narrative that education is in crisis, that the education system is breaking down, and to an extent, you can sort of see why they've got an increasing number of children missing from school. And they're sort of talking about this being a breakdown in this home and school contract, the relationship between them, maybe blaming it on when schools shut or went to remote learning during the lockdowns, COVID-19. But perhaps we need to think sort of more deeper than that. Maybe we need to sort of really reflect on our practice and what we teach in schools and what's going on. And for many young people, what we're teaching about, it can seem really abstract. It's so far removed from their everyday existence. But I find that if you can find ways to connect what they're learning in school with their real lives, with their academic learning and the real lives coming together, that you can release a passion that's inside of these young people. You see them coming out of the shells. And that's one of the reasons why I sort of think that, embedding these current affairs, making things relevant, making these young people draw those connections between what they're learning, what they're seeing in the news, on their social media, out the window every day. Now, in the UK, over the past sort of decade or so, we've seen this big push, this big move to what's called a knowledge-rich curriculum. And now, knowledge, of course, is not a bad thing, but what matters is not simply being able to recall knowledge, but also to be able to understand it, to critique what we're told. And of course, the purpose of education is to teach not to teach young people, it's to teach young people to be able to think. So the purpose of education is to teach young people to be able to think, not simply to recall what other people think. And I often turn, as many do, to Paulo Freire, the educationalist, who most famously known for Pedagogy of the Oppressed and his criticisms of what he called the banking model of education, in which a student's mind is viewed as an empty vessel to be filled with the teacher's knowledge. And he argued that this banking model transforms students into simply receiving objects. And the purpose of this is to control their thinking, control their action, and it leads them to adjust to the world and inhibits their creative power. And we know that, in the real world, creativity is one of those things that is valued so much by businesses, by society. And sometimes with the model of education that we're focusing on, rather than fostering creativity, we're fostering conformity. And if we have an education system that is simply centered around recalling knowledge, recalling facts, general knowledge, then this rote learning model, even if it's well-intentioned, and it usually is well-intentioned, it can create a culture of silence within our schools, within our classrooms, within our societies more broadly. And it can lead simply to students to accepting what they hear without really thinking about it. And it's so important, therefore, to foster in our classrooms a culture where the default mode of our pupils is to question us. And I often find I reward my pupils if they pull me up on things, if they question me. Well, why is that? Why do you think that? Sometimes it's seen by some as a challenge to their authority, but really what it should be seen as is a positive, something that we should really be promoting with them. And Freire, recognised that our young people should gain what he called critical consciousness, and by doing so, they could recognise their own self-worth and release their own potential. And by examining current affairs and the news and what's going on around us, we can teach our pupils to not just consume information, not to be passive consumers, but active participants and active citizens, and shape the world around them. And they can learn to question the narratives that they're hearing, need to discern the biases within the news that they consume, and form their own opinions around that. And for me, this is the bedrock of responsible citizenship, replacing apathy with engagement, replacing silence with informed voices. Now, I've got 2 young children of my own, and I'm a firm believer that children are far more capable of what we give them credit for. I'm always amazed by what my children can learn, what my children pick up, what they repeat back to me, the questions they asked. And another educator, I often go back to is Bell Hooks, and she wrote a book on critical thinking that, in preparation for this session, I reread. And she said that children are organically predisposed to be critical thinkers. Across the boundaries of race, class, gender, and circumstance, children come into a world of wonder and language consumed with a desire for knowledge. And I love that quote. The idea that, no matter who they are, children want to learn. They want to be critical thinkers. They're amazed by the world around them. Sometimes that's lost, it's stifled, and that's, such a shame. And anyone with children will recognize that this situation. Your child comes to you, they ask you a question, and you tell them, you respond with the answer. And they say to you, why? And so you respond again. And then they say to you, why? And then you respond again, and they say, why? And this why goes on and on and on. And guilty of this myself, you end up saying, well, it just is. And that's because these children are these relentless interrogators. And Bell Hooks, again, she says, sometimes children are so eager for knowledge that they become relentless interrogators. They demand to know the who, the what, the when, the whys of life. They're searching for answers, and they learn instinctively how to think by doing so. They naturally want to know everything. But, sometimes myself included, we're guilty of snuffing out this passion. And we have a world where we're told, that we want people to be creative, but then we reward conformity. And Bell Hooks goes on to talk about how children are taught really early on in life that thinking actually is the dangerous thing by their peers, by their teachers, by their parents, by society. She says that because of this, sadly, children stop enjoying the process of thinking and they start actually fearing the thinking mind. This might be in homes where the parents teach via a model of discipline and punishment, that it's better to choose obedience over self-awareness and self-determination. It might be in schools where independent thinking is not seen as an acceptable behavior. Most children in our nation and in the world, in many countries, are told to suppress this memory of thinking as a passionate, pleasurable activity. And that's something we need to challenge. We need children to think, to enjoy thinking, to enjoy learning. And they're not going to do this by just having to recall information, by having to write it down on blank worksheets. There's only so much engagement you're going to get from that. And maybe we should be looking, at our model of education and thinking, well, is this what's responsible for a crisis in education? Is this what's broken the contract between home and school? Is this why children are switching off, tuning out? Now, in society, never before have we had such access to or been bombarded with such information. And we want our children, do we want them to be passive consumers of this information that they're getting from TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat and social media and the television and computer games? Do you want them to be passive consumers of this, or do you want them to be critical consumers of this? I think everyone here knows the answer to that. Now, there's a saying that might seem quite relevant to the times. It's been said so much, it almost is a cliche now. And it's that the first casualty when war comes is the truth. And we're living in an age of war, of crisis. We're living in an age of AI, deep fakes, propaganda. Sometimes it's hard to know what is real. And this saying that the first casualty of war is the truth, there's a disagreement even over who first said that. A US senator in the 1920s, who'd been quoted as having said it, or a Greek dramatist in 550 BC has also been quoted as having said it. So maybe this struggle to understand the truth isn't a new phenomenon. Maybe it's something that's always existed. And we're going to think about, where do people get their news from? Now, if we were to go back, not that long ago, 40 years, most people would have got their news from print newspapers, from public service broadcasters. But the sales of traditional newspapers has declined so much now that if you actually, some polls done of young people, 83% of 16 to 24-year-olds get the news from online sources. 83%. And you might think this is maybe a bit alarming, that that they're getting it from this wild west of media. But actually, maybe it could be liberating. Traditional news is sometimes seen as being under the influence of corporate or government interests. Whereas this new media, social media, online platforms, has the potential to be a much more democratic system. anyone can post online, anyone can post on Twitter or Facebook, anyone can set up their own websites. It's not, the means of distributing this knowledge are no longer in the hands of a select few, but have the potential to be distributed to the masses. But of course, this also adds an added impetus to us as educators and our need to teach young people to be critical consumers, critical thinkers. Now, we talk about this idea of misinformation and disinformation because with this democratization, obviously, means there's also an ability for people to spread this information for their own purposes. Now, this isn't to say this doesn't happen in traditional media. We're often hearing criticisms of the BBC for being biased. Usually those criticisms are coming from both sides at the same time. And this sort of desire to be impartial can sometimes be seen as biased by both parties. So misinformation and disinformation are definitely not a new thing. But the social media and technologies have made it much easier, quicker, cheaper than ever before to spread this information and to huge audiences or specific targeted groups. And there's, a massive potential for influencing elections, influencing people's patterns of behavior. Now, one of the main problems with this, even if people don't believe this misinformation, even if we're saying that people are critical consumers of this information, even if we think that actually, this bias stuff, it's not as big a problem as we think of, the problem is it affects people's faith in the democratic system. Even if you yourself believe that you are a critical consumer of information, you're probably going to think that your neighbour isn't, the guy down the road isn't. Those young people or those older people aren't critical consumers. And there was some polling evidence that showed that fake news leads to a loss of trust of citizens in each other. And this is a major cause of destabilizing democratic processes and undermining the morally justified democratic institutions. And Dr. Martin Reglitz from the Center of the Study of Global Ethics said this. He said that citizens may come to view laws and processes or even the whole democratic system itself as no longer worthy of respect. They seem to be based on false beliefs, bad choices of a manipulated majority of voters. So you believe that other people are not critical consumers of news. You believe that they're making bad choices. And what's the point in voting if people are going to be just seen as being uncritical consumers? They've made the bad choice. There's no point. And this obviously leads to fall in turnout in elections, lack of faith in politicians, and so on. So because of all of these reasons, it's so important to teach pupils that when we do embed news and media into our lessons, that we teach them to spot the misinformation and the disinformation. And also to provide them with reliable, child-friendly news sources. Now, the National Education Union in Britain gave some guidance recently about the importance of media literacy. And they pointed out that our role as teachers should be to teach pupils to think critically, to develop their ability to differentiate between fake news and real news, to recognize the perspective and the message behind the news that they consume, to learn to differentiate from facts from opinion, to understand the need to consult a wide range of sources, to check the veracity of the source material, and to learn how to use and create their own media responsibly, both mainstream media and social media. I sort of take that as a guiding principle in my lessons. We'll take a news source and we'll look at it and we'll think about, well, why are they saying this? What's the message? What's the purpose of this? What are they trying to get across to me? Showing them where this information came from. Is there a footnote? Is there a reference? Is there a link? Is there somewhere we can double check this information? Now, I said before, I'm head of PSHE and citizenship at my school. So PSHE, personal, social, health education, citizenship. I also teach geography and a bit of English sometimes. So current affairs is so important to include into your lessons. Now, as the head of PSHE, I've got a team of form tutors who deliver the PSHE curriculum, half an hour every morning to all the pupils in my school, so for 1,000 pupils. And I really wanted to make sure that current affairs are firmly embedded into our curriculum. And I'm always thinking as well, not just in PSHE, but in geography, in history, in religious studies, in English lessons, all across the curriculum. Now, like I say, we have this PSHE tutor time, and what our pupils do is they spend 1.5 hour lesson every week investigating a news article, and we use the day.co.uk's website with form tutors. And what this does is it allows me to ensure that I am giving my pupils an unbiased news source. And I encourage them to compare this news story with how it's presented by other news sources, by social media, by traditional media. So the day is, it's purposely designed to be unbiased. It's written for a school-aged audience. It's differentiated between different reading levels, going all the way up to A levels, so 17, 18-year-olds, going all the way down to primary age pupils, age 5 and onwards. And it's done in a way that doesn't patronize, it doesn't dumb down the message. It gives them a reliable news source. It's how news should be. It's unbiased, it's referenced. We know that there isn't a message that they're trying to get across to us. They are just presenting the news. And it's so important to be able to show them what a good news source looks like. So then when they're consuming their own news sources, they can perhaps, compare and contrast this. Now, the key to teaching children to be critical thinkers is to teach them the art of questioning. And this is at the heart of the day's mission, which is why I'm such a big advocate for the day. And on the website, they say that their belief is that the right question matters more than the right answer. And I think that's such a perfect way of summing up what we need to be doing here. And every article from the day starts and ends with a debate question. And this is such a useful way to build up dialogue and to, sometimes quite complex and even quite controversial topics. So what we'll do is there'll be an article from the day. And what I'll actually do is I'll just share now the homepage of the day, just to sort of show you sort of my thought process as we would be going along. So what I would do, so I'll load this up. We have a number of different news articles, and usually I'll let my pupils choose which one they would like to look at. So we've quite a few different articles here from recently. So we'll go for a politics one. And this is all about the House of Commons meltdown over the Gaza vote. So quite, a complex topic based around, protocols within, government decision making and politics. We can change this, depending on, have I got a class who is in year 7, or have I got a class who's in year 11, depending on your own pupils that are in front of you. And we have an article here, and we've got a question: should the Speaker of the House of Commons resign? Now, what I'd normally do is I'd start with that before we read the article. And I'm sort of gauging what they know about this story already. Chances are they'll have, they've picked up on this from conversations with parents, from social media. If it's a big story like this, there will usually be some sort of background knowledge. Now, once we've done that, we will read through the article, and some quite complex terms in here, quite specific terms which are referenced, makes it really easy. There's a number of different features that make it easier to read. And then at the end, it ends with sort of a summing up. And what I like to do is I like to read them the arguments for, the arguments against, and I usually leave the last bit out, which is the sort of more nuanced view, till the end, and we'll hold a class vote on it. Before we hold the class vote, I like to discuss with them, question them about their beliefs. So as we're reading it, I'll be stopping and I'll be trying to get feedback from pupils, get them to expand on their responses. So, do you think he should resign? Yeah, I definitely think he should resign. Well, why do you think that? Asking questions all the time. What do you mean by that? Do you expand on that? Could you explain what you mean? Do you think it's always the same case? Why do you think that? And then maybe, taking it around the room, who can add to that? Does anyone disagree with that? Does anyone agree? Why do you agree? And it's asking these questions as you're going on, being a relentless questioner, like we sort of would hope children were. But why would they be thinking that? Why are they trying to tell you that? Where have you heard that from? And then we'll hold a vote. Should the speaker resign? We'll vote yes, no. And then, then we'll discuss maybe the results. Were we surprised by those results? And again, pointing pupils to some of the information on here. Now, the nuanced answer that actually it's probably not as black and white as we would perhaps originally think. It probably isn't a yes or no answer. They usually will accept that, that there are shades of grey within this. Teaching them, to be, where does this information come from? Like I say, it's footnoted. You've got your sources at the bottom there. You can explain. And, I would share this with pupils. You can share it as homework. You can share it in a lesson on your learning platforms. And if pupils want to learn more about it, which often it's something they do, we've got a number of different news sources where they can become an expert. And there's, it's fantastic. I won't go on too much about this, but, sort of questions, activities, investigations, work for pupils to do independently or as part of the lesson, worksheets to download and other sections that are similar. So some of these topics can be quite controversial. So if we're thinking about sort of on a more practical level, that was sort of the why we should do it, but the how do we do it? I think it's really important not to shy away from controversial topics. I will allow my pupils to pick topics from the day's website, which I perhaps wouldn't have picked, depending on the background of your pupils, the culture, religious backgrounds. There might be some topics that you think this is going to be a difficult conversation. And I think it's so important not to shy away from this, because if they're not getting the information from us, if they're not being able to pick it apart and criticize it in a safe environment of a classroom, they're going to be doing that somewhere else. And that somewhere else is probably going to be maybe at home, maybe with their friends, maybe in social media. So don't shy away from these topics. There's going to be difficult questions. It's important that you've got some knowledge of this topic. Maybe you've had questioned your own beliefs, your own biases before you go into teaching this. Do a bit of research, preempt some of the questions that may be asked. Have a think about what the answers might be. There are always going to be some curveballs in there. There's always going to be some questions that you couldn't prepare for. But also, think about, if you don't know the answer, being honest with it. Think about how you're going to deal with not knowing the answer. Admit to them you don't know the answer. Stick to the facts. Try and remain neutral as much as possible. Try not to let your emotions cloud your judgment. And don't try and bluff it. If you don't know the answer, tell them. Talk to them about how we might find that information out. How could we research it? What would be a good way of looking at it? Where could we look for more information? Who could we talk to? What might be the problems with that? Would we encounter biases when we're trying to do that? And sometimes these debates can get quite heated. And it's important to, remain calm, remain sensitive to the fact that there's going to be a diverse range of opinions in there. And I would say, don't just rush straight into that. It is important to create a culture within your classroom where pupils feel confident, where pupils feel comfortable, where they know that their answers are going to be listened to, their opinions are going to be heard. And, I don't like the idea of having rules for discussions, but I want to talk about this more of the norms of conversation. I did a webinar recently about the idea of oracy, and we talked about this. With oracy, there's norms of conversation. It's not rules, but it's just what, as a society, we've all agreed to. We will listen to each other. We won't talk over each other. We'll ask polite questions. We'll allow people to be heard. We'll not criticize the person, will criticize the idea, and we'll take turns. Establishing these norms of conversation within your classroom can make these discussions, much more friendly, supportive atmosphere, and pupils will feel comfortable to become critical thinkers. Now, as I say, if we don't do it in the classroom, the pupils are going to have these conversations elsewhere. And often people will seek out echo chambers. Now, an echo chamber, there's a book called The Echo Chamber by Jameson and Capella, and they define it as a bounded, enclosed media space that has a potential to magnify messages delivered within them and insulate them from rebuttal. And an echo chamber, you're going to give your opinion and everyone's going to agree with you. And you're going to reinforce the fact that you must be right because everybody agrees with you. That idea has been magnified. No one's disagreed with you. Within a classroom, we need to do the exact opposite of that. We want to encourage those rebuttals. We're encouraging pupils to question each other in a polite way, in a friendly way, in a supportive way. We need to make sure that pupils are exposed to a variety of views, that their own opinions are robustly critiqued, that they can robustly critique each other, they can robustly critique the teacher, the article that's been shared. Now, kids are capable of so much, but so much more than we sometimes imagine. But sometimes, they do get bored, they do switch off. And they do struggle to connect the real life with the academic. So not just in PSHE, but we need to think about how do we make our lessons come alive. In geography, that sometimes is quite simple. If we're teaching about a hurricane, there's often a couple of hurricanes every year. If we're teaching about volcanic eruptions, we can show them news articles, video footage. It's an amazing resource. And by doing so, by connecting this real life learning, the academic learning, we can release this passion for thinking within our pupils. And I've seen, students that would perhaps struggle academically really come alive in some of these discussions on current affairs because they see that it's real. It's not some abstract concept. It's not something that happened hundreds of years ago, but it's something that's happening today. It's something that affects their lives, their friends' lives, their future. And by doing so, we can build these sort of life skills that are so important, for society, that we're told all the time that, businesses value. I'm not of the opinion that we should allow businesses to dictate what we teach in our schools or how we teach in our schools, but, these are the skills that they say they value. Critical thinking is always top of the list. Strong communication skills, top of the list. To be able to express oneself clearly, persuasively, to be able to research, to have information literacy, to have confidence, but also empathy. Now, businesses value these, but I think these are some good values that we should be encouraging in everyone in society. Empathy, listening to others, understanding. In this world which is, beset, as I said, by multiple crises, the ability to have empathy, to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to understand what's going on, to be critical consumers, to understand why someone's telling us this information. So by embedding our current affairs into our lessons, we can make those lessons come alive. And we can teach young people not only to interpret the world, but give them the power to also change it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was absolutely fascinating. And I really enjoyed hearing everything you had to tell us. I mean, from my own perspective as someone who has worked in the media, but also someone who's in politics, it was really interesting for me to hear. Now, I have a question for you. And you talked about echo chambers, and I think that's a really important topic, especially in relation to social media. That and we're talking about mass social media, not necessarily some of the deep echo chambers like 4chan or whatever that some of the conspiracy theorists coalesce around. Now, you know, I mean, I think back to you know, studying media and communications, and Jürgen Habermas and his conception of the bourgeois public sphere, which was, you know, really nascent in the age when trading journals would come in, and you know, you'd have people meeting up in cafes and salons and reading the newspapers of the day, and they're all reading the same material, all discussing the same material. Now, that to me feels like it's fragmented in recent years, especially, as you say, with the decline of the traditional print media, but also with the rise of social media. Now, how do you prevent, or how do you tackle in the classroom the capacity of social media to produce echo chambers among your students? I mean, an example I would use is, so for example, I'm in politics in my spare time when I'm not T4 Education's communications director. I'm also a Labour Party councillor in London, and so I'm on the left of politics. So my echo chamber, everything I see on my Facebook feed is all left-wing political news, basically. My brother, who's you know, a martial artist, only gets things from, you know, his community, and actually he it turns out that most of the people who engage in his martial arts class tend to believe right-wing conspiracy theories for some reason. So he quit Facebook as a result of that. That's a complete, and his experience of Facebook completely different from mine based on his interests. Now, do you find your kids coming into the classroom and having these preconceived notions based on the social media they consume? And how do you break that down, essentially?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and sometimes it's you know, we don't always recognize it, do we? You know, we start believing that everyone believes the same as us because that's what we're seeing all the time. I wouldn't recommend people to sort of step outside of those echo chambers sometimes into places like 4chan or whatever else, because that could be a scary place in itself, can't it? It's about teaching them to be those critical consumers. And I will often ask my pupils, so what have you heard in the news this week? And I like, you know, we'll come up with things that they've heard in the news, and sometimes we'll suggest them to the day to run as stories. You know, if it's something that they're interested in, they've heard about. And often I get some bizarre answers. You know, so they tell me something. Where have you heard that? Oh, TikTok. You know, yeah, I've had all of them. We've all heard it on TikTok. We've all heard it. And then again, it's just about slowly, you know, not belittling it, not making fun of it, which sometimes, you know, can be quite tempting to do, but to sort of break it down and go, well, where did you hear that? Why did you hear that? You know, who are you following? What's that? You know, get them to question, well, why is that person telling me that? Have other people been said that? And get them to really unpick, you know, why they've heard that. And, you know, giving them a variety of different news sources. For a while, I ran a geography in the news club, and I used to bring in copies of the Daily Express, which is obviously as a right-wing newspaper, and copies of the Morning Star, which is a fantastic left-wing newspaper in the UK. And we, you know, I'd get them to look at these sort of two side by side, and sometimes it's, you know, as a teacher, you've got to be politically neutral in Britain anyway. There's a responsibility. And I think it is important, you know, to be able to lay out those different sides of the argument and just get them to question, you know, why is someone telling me this? And just social media in general. Just get them to question what's in it for Facebook, you know, what's in it for TikTok. You know, there's always that big thing, isn't there? If you don't know what they're selling, then it's probably you that they are selling. And explaining to them about the algorithms. You know, there's quite a lot of evidence that the algorithms on YouTube, for example, will send people down further and further and further into right-wing conspiracy theories. And just there's nothing you can do about this, but you can get them to recognize it, you can get them to understand it, and giving them the knowledge and the understanding, giving them the tools to be critical consumers, and just get them to question that is all we can do, really. And just teaching them, you know, how to stay safe on these platforms.
Thank you, Robert. So I'm going to say to everyone here, if you've got any questions and you want to speak out loud, please do raise your hand, or you can put questions in the chat and I will read them out. Please do start them coming in. Also, if you've got any comments, anything you want to share in your experience of teaching current affairs in the curriculum, please do raise your hand and share it with the group. This is for everyone to learn from each other. For example, Khalid Hamid has written in the chat, for me, I use active learning methods, ask students to engage their learning by thinking, discussing, investigating, and creating. In class, students practice skills, solve problems, struggle with complex questions, make decisions, propose solutions, and explain ideas in their own words through writing and discussion. Thank you for sharing that, Khalid. That's a really interesting insight. So if other people would like to come forward with any questions, I've got a couple coming in now. So I've got Alejandra asking, what advice would you give me to socialize with teachers who show certain resistance to these pedagogical practices with which I fully agree, and personally I find it difficult in some cases it is reflected in the classrooms? I'm vice principal of a primary school.
I know definitely in Britain and in the US there's a big divide in education, and this is only split between what they call the traditional and the progressive camps of education. And the traditional camp is sort of seen as your banking model of education, and your progressive camp is seen as your more based around free air and the idea of critical thinking. And at times it's getting quite heated, and people sort of started seeing this almost like a football team. I'm the progressive, I'm the traditionalist, and they're sort of becoming very divided. And really, I think it's about trying to get out of that mindset that it has to be one or the other. And it's about accepting that there are elements of both that are very important. And I think the argument has, become so heated that people have forgotten, the purpose of education. It is to be critical thinkers and also to provide knowledge. And it's about finding that right balance between it. So I would always start by sort of looking at, what are the benefits of, if in your school, with the teachers in your school, that they, are focused very much on this, a traditional banking model of education, accepting that there are benefits to that, and including elements of that within your classroom. Being able to recall certain facts is very important if you want to be able to make, make reasoned assumptions. And also understanding where it comes from. This traditionalist, although I don't really like the terms traditional and progressive, because I think traditionally teaching children to think critically has existed, and in progressive paradigms, teaching people to recall knowledge has also existed. So anyway, but we stick to these. Why is this traditionalist mode becoming so popular? Well, in Britain, in the past sort of 10, 20 years, it's become so popular because there's league tables of schools. There is Ofsted judgments by where external government agencies come in and judge schools, how effective schools are. There is performance-related pay, where teachers are paid depending on the results that pupils get. And there's this sort of obsession with grading within schools. And if everything that you are being told is that it's all about pupils getting this grade, this grade, this grade, and you will not be paid as much if you don't do it, then it's very difficult to be inventive and to come up with teaching your pupils to think critically when at the end of the day they've got to pass a test, and the test is based around them knowing certain knowledge. Sometimes it's quite difficult. We can affect what happens in our classroom. We can affect what happens, in our school, and we can try and convince people beyond that. And sometimes what is needed is, a radical overhaul of education. And I'm inclined to believe that what we do need is a radical overhaul of education, with a renewed focus on, on these critical thinking and skills, while also trying to, be rigorous. Schools should be rigorous. We shouldn't underestimate what children can do. It's not about dumbing down. It's about aiming high, having aspirations about what our young people can do. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, have those conversations and find out what you've got in common. And you'll probably find that actually you've got a lot in common. You probably are doing a lot of similar things, finding that middle ground between it.
Thank you, Robert. I think you got a thumbs up from Alejandra there, and a heart from Alejandra, in fact. So thank you. I think that sounds like it does answer the question. That's great. I'm going to take Daniel next.
Thank you so much, Robert. So while you were sharing, I just remembered my experience in my former school. So in a primary school before joining T4. So here in Nigeria and in most parts of Africa, we can there are certain states that are quite sensitive to religion. So much so that um, there are places where kids will go to, they're like formative schools where they go to before they start formal education. So in those places, whatever you were taught, you take it hook, line, and sinker, right? And then they grow up with that perception, with the mindset of not to question anything that they hear from, you know, some religious quarters, right? So, and then when they now come to school, and you as the teacher, you're trying to get them to begin to question lots of things that they hear. Because on the radio, once is that religious leader sharing something they believe is the absolute truth. So it now becomes very difficult for you to want to stir up that ability in your kids to want to ask questions. Because if you push for that, you may be doing that at the detriment of your life, right? So what would be your counsel to teachers that find themselves in those kinds of contexts where it's absolutely raise their students to ask questions? Because the moment they start asking questions, you find their parents in school, and then it can get really very messy. So what would be your advice to teachers in that kind of environment?
Wow. I mean, I suppose I feel quite privileged that, to a big extent, that isn't my experience. That is not my experience in a school in the northwest of England. We do have I've taught in schools with a number of people from very religious backgrounds, one way or another, and you do at times have find that parents are unhappy with what's being taught, and it's about I've said it before, it's about maintaining that impartiality in yourself. You are not giving your opinions, you are just teaching them how to question things, and you know staying away from certain topics might be more sensible in certain scenarios than other. If it's your personal safety, then obviously I wouldn't recommend going in really controversial there. But if you create that culture of questioning, then you would hope that they will then take that further than themselves. If you can create a culture of questioning around things which are not necessarily controversial, or things which the parents in your community would not be offended by, you just got to hope that critical consciousness, that critical thinking skills will rub off, and they will be able to make question themselves. And hopefully we can have enough people learning to question things that that we can get beyond that. But good luck in your sort of context there, because I think that it is very different to my situation, and quite difficult to put myself in those shoes, really, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it is very radically different context, I think we're talking about here. But I mean, interestingly enough, Robert, I mean, I used to work with a teacher called Andrew Moffat. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was teaching kids about same-sex relationships and about diversity and equality, and that led to him getting death threats from religious communities around his school. And I think it ultimately is about every teacher, I would imagine, understanding what their personal circumstances is and what they feel comfortable doing. Andrew ultimately felt like he was going to carry on with that, and all power to him. But obviously, people have to put their personal safety first as well. Of course, I quite understand that, and I quite understand the challenges that you would have gone through, Daniel, as well. Okay, I've got a question from Caro. Caro, do you want to read out your question?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Well, I am a history teacher, and sometimes I struggle with making my lessons real and alive, as you mentioned. My students often think as history being completely useless, or like it has any doesn't have any sense in studying that because it's all about dead people. I mean, who cares about people from the past, right? So how could I include these current affairs into my lessons?
Yeah, really good question. I think it's really important to teach current affairs as a chain of historical events. So if we can see what is happening now. So I think it's important from both aspects, isn't it? When we're teaching current affairs, we need to not see it as a certain thing that is happening in the present, but as a number of events that have led up to what is happening now. So in that sense, it's so important to teach history with the context of within the context of current affairs. But then if you flip it around the other way, if we're looking at it could be in a history lesson, you are teaching about the transport of enslaved people to the Americas. Well, then you could find a story that's happening today and think about, well, what was the chain of events that has led to this certain events happening in the US today? Obviously, I mean, some are easier than others. You know, if you were teaching the history of the Middle East, then the current crisis in Palestine at the moment, you know, obviously should not be seen as an individual an event that happened in October last year. It should be seen as an ongoing series of events that have happened over the past hundreds of years, thousands of years. So yeah, the two are definitely so intertwined, and got to look at it from both angles. And I think pupils would really engage with that, you know, if they could see that this isn't a dead historical event, but something that has had definitely a knock-on effect to today. In geography, we teach about Nigeria, actually, as a case study. And as part of that, I will teach about the colonial background of you know, Western Empire, British Empire, you know, within Nigeria. And I think you have to link the two. You cannot understand one without the other. So yeah, make your history lessons come alive with current affairs, but also make sure you explain your current affairs in a historical context.
Thank you, Robert. I think we've got time for probably one more question. I do have a question for you, actually, Robert, but I'll give the floor to anyone else who has a burning question first, if they would like. Do you stick your hand up, or do you stick something in chat? Cool. So, I mean, I was thinking about how to build global citizenship, Robert, and it's something that we talk about quite a lot at T4 Education. We engage with our global community of teachers quite a lot on that basis, because I personally think it is very important for us to be, you know, training the next generation to be global citizens rather than national citizens. And how important do you think selecting the right media for their consumption is when or discussing the right media in class, and how do you prioritize the stories that you talk to them about? Obviously you talked about Britain's colonial history, but how do you create a good balance of purely international stories versus purely, you know, domestic stories, so that kids are getting a very real sense of their place in the much wider world?
Yeah, I think that this idea of internationalism is so important, and I feel like we've lived through a period of history of growing internationalism, and we're now collapsing back into nation states and splintering off into little groups. And I think we're seeing this sort of all around the world, people closing back in on themselves after, you know, sort of a post-war sort of drive for internationalism. So allowing, you know, getting people to understand things beyond their border, you know, and again, it's about building those empathy, isn't it? You know, that actually someone, a child in a worker in Nigeria has got just as much in common with you, and teaching people about, you know, these different contexts. I'm teaching a unit of work to my Year 9 pupils at the moment about Africa, and the first lesson that I've done on this was talking about there being no single story. And this is something that you can find online about this. There is no single story. Going beyond stereotypes. I did a Google image search for Africa, and the pictures that came up, were of beautiful animals, beautiful landscapes, starving people, wars, people dying, and it's this. Again about teaching people to be critical consumers, getting them to realize, well, there is no single story. As a Western person, you saw them pictures, you would think you had nothing in common with any of those people whatsoever. So it's about how do we find those stories that allow us to make the connections between ourselves and those people, whether they're in Buenos Aires or Lagos or Bolton. How do we draw those connections? How do we allow pupils to see that we've got more in common than what separates us? And I think by doing so, we can combat, the rising tide of nationalism around the world, and it's quite dangerous, sort of introspective looking. And it's important for people to understand their own context as well, and be able to challenge what is going on in their own societies. The first battle that perhaps we should all be having is looking at what we can do within our own countries to change them, and also at the same time looking at what is happening in other countries and trying to create that sense of empathy within our young people, remove this sense of othering, and all try and be a bit more understanding of each other.
Thank you very much, Robert, and I think that's a wonderful message to conclude on. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today for this absolutely excellent talk. Thank you, Robert, for giving it. Thank you to our friends at the Day for helping arrange this talk. Remember, you can get a 10% discount as a T4 Communities member at the Day, and it really is a fantastic magazine, so please do check it out. That's all we have time for today, so it just leaves me to say one final thank you and goodbye. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.